Hello, my name is Sue Linderman. I'm pleased to be back with you again for part 3 of our 6-video series exploring some of the lesser known aspects of our country's history. Our purpose in this class series is to enhance our understanding of racism in America by exploring the history of our country that we didn't learn in school. Much of the racial turmoil in our country can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional economic and public policy. Understanding this history gives us a foundation for action to address the profound inequities that exist in our society today. So let's continue. First, a brief recap of our previous video. We looked at the period after the Civil War and Reconstruction when Black codes were enacted across the South. These were laws that applied only to Black citizens. They identified minor infractions that would result in the arrest and incarceration of Black, mainly men. Then, once incarcerated, these convicts could be leased by the state to railroads, to plantations, to other commercial concerns, and the income from their labor would accrue to the states. This practice also perpetuated the view, the stereotype of the Black man as a dangerous criminal. And all of this was done to circumvent or to take advantage of the loophole in the 13th Amendment that offered freedom to slaves except in the case of conviction of a crime. In 1896, the Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson established the doctrine of separate but equal. And this was implemented through a wide variety of laws known as Jim Crow laws that served to ensure that Blacks and whites would not dine together, travel together, stay in hotels together. If you saw the movie Green Book, you saw some examples of what it took for an African American to travel safely, particularly in the South. These laws were enforced through a variety of means, but one of the most spectacular was the use of terror lynchings. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,500 of these terror lynchings occurred, and their whole purpose was to demonstrate to the African American community that they had no refuge in law or in protection from the agents of the state. In many cases, in these terror spectacle lynchings, the governor would be present, the mayor, the police chief, and these horrific crimes against African Americans resulted in a wave of terror whose consequences continue to exist today. And the gap between African American citizens and law enforcement continues to reverberate the actions taken during this period. And as a consequence of all of this violence, the restrictive laws, and the lack of economic opportunity, the Great Migration began. The movement of more than 4 million African Americans from the South to states in the North and the West. So now we're going to turn our attention to the mid-20th century and talk about a series of public policies that were enacted at the federal level and implemented at the state level. Policies with regard to housing, Social Security, the GI Bill, and education. And then that will bring us to the period of the 1950s and 60s at the height of the civil rights movement. We'll look at the key events from that period and the consequences of the advocacy and the protests that occurred to see what worked and what does not. So to begin with housing segregation, Until 1917, cities across the country mandated the areas where Blacks could live. And so segregation was real and total and enforced by municipal action. In 1917, there was a Supreme Court decision in the case Buchanan v. Warley that said that those municipally mandated zoning restrictions were unconstitutional. They violated the 14th Amendment. Well, not to be outdone, cities and states became very creative and developed the instrument of racially restricted deed covenants. These were clauses added to property deeds that specified that an owner could only sell this property to someone who was white. This became such a popular instrument in the wake of the Supreme Court decision in 1917 that by 1940, 80% of the properties in Chicago and Los Angeles and 85% of the properties in Detroit carried these racially restricted deed covenants, meaning that Black citizens, Black people were not allowed to purchase these properties owned by whites. Another Supreme Court case in 1948, Shelley v. Kramer, the court ruled that these covenants weren't illegal, but enforcing them was. So it was unconstitutional for these covenants to be enforced, but if you voluntarily wanted to adhere to them, have at it. And so the process continued until 1968 with the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And so it wasn't until 1968 that Blacks should ostensibly be free to purchase properties in areas or properties previously currently owned by whites. In reality, the practice didn't really stop then, and there have been additional instances of this occurring, but hard to prove. We look at the Federal Housing Administration, which was created by the National Housing Act of 1934. At the time, following the Great Depression, the housing market was in great disarray. New homes weren't being built, people didn't have an opportunity to purchase homes. The situation was really dire. And so the Congress created the Federal Housing Administration, whose purpose was to ensure mortgage loans issued to home buyers. They didn't issue the mortgages, they insured them. Coincident with the formation of the Federal Housing Administration, the federal government commissioned what it called residential security maps in 239 cities across the country. And these maps led to the process which is commonly known as redlining. For each of these 239 cities, a map like this was produced. And its purpose was to identify for FHA underwriters those areas where the FHA felt comfortable in insuring mortgages because of the relative risk. So there were 4 categories. Green was the best. FHA would have no problem insuring mortgages for properties in these areas. Blue was categorized as still desirable, meaning there was some issue, but all in all, the risk of issuing a mortgage was considered low. Yellow was definitely declining. And these were areas that typically were occupied by both Black and white residents. The green, typically all white, the blue, all white, but maybe some neighboring communities that were looking a little sketchy. Yellow was declining and red was hazardous, meaning don't issue a mortgage here because you likely won't be paid back. Now, there was actually no economic or demographic reasoning behind that. It was simply a function of race. And so these redlined areas, it became virtually impossible for people to, white or Black, to get a mortgage in these areas, or a home improvement loan for that matter. And so it accelerated the decline of minority occupied areas of these 239 cities. So to accomplish this, there were a series of racial provisions written into the FHA underwriting manual. So as an underwriter went to assess whether an FHA insured mortgage should be issued by the bank, they had some rules to follow. The valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances, and to be really effective, should include this series of provisions, including prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. The social class of the parents of children at the school in many instances have a vital bearing. Thus, although physical surrounds of a neighborhood area may be favorable and conducive to enjoyable, pleasant living in its locations, if the children of people living in such an area are compelled to attend school where a goodly number of the pupils represent a far lower level of society or an incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist. And so Black property owners were again locked out of the opportunity to move up, to buy new homes, to improve their residential and economic condition. And these same conditions were adopted by the Veterans Administration, and we will see the impact reverberate into the GI Bill. So what was a Black person to do who wanted to buy a house and had the money to buy a house, had the financial wherewithal to buy a house, but could not get an FHA mortgage? Well, contracts for deed developed as an alternative. These contracts for deed were offered by private institutions. And the approach was really quite interesting. These contract for deed agents would buy up properties in various areas of these cities. One of the tactics they would use would be to go to one of the blue or the yellow areas that we saw, hire a Black woman to push a baby carriage up and down the streets, and then an agent of the contract for deed company would start knocking on doors and say, you know, they're coming. And you don't want to be the last to have your house up for sale when they're here. And so they would acquire these properties at below market prices and then offer them to Black citizens at above market prices, because of course, there were whole swaths of the cities where the possibility of a purchase didn't even exist. Not only would they be offered to Black citizens at higher than market rates, the interest rates offered were at higher than market rates. And these were contracts for deed. The purchaser did not own the property. The purchaser had no equity in the property. The deed was only transferred when the contract was paid in full. And very often at the end of the contract, there would be an unexpected charge, an insurance bill that covered the period of the contract that had to be paid before the resident, the property hopeful owner, could take possession of the property. And sometimes this would be thousands of dollars. And if the person who had the contract couldn't afford it, the home returned to the contract offerer. If a resident, someone under one of these contracts couldn't make a payment, they could be evicted and they would lose all the money that they had paid and have nothing to show for it. And this happened in city after city after city across the country. And it's actually, you hear the echo of it in the subprime mortgage crisis that happened more recently, where lower income and particularly Black home owners were targeted with those instruments that failed them. So what's a consequence of this? From 1934 to 1968, with the passage of the Fair Housing Act, those kinds of constraints on Black home ownership existed across the country and lead to some of the economic conditions that we see today. Black families typically have an income that is 60% that of whites, and even more importantly or profoundly, a wealth that is 5% of whites. Because for decades, for many of us, our greatest level of equity existed in the value of our homes. And Black Americans did not have the right or the ability to share in that equity improvement. And even more broadly, this housing policy perpetuated housing segregation with all of its corollary disadvantages. Housing segregation led to educational segregation. In many areas, schools are funded by property taxes. And so the lesser attractive, lesser valued property areas have fewer funds to expend on education, leading to inequality in educational opportunity, leading to inequity in employment opportunity, leading to further economic impact. And so the cascade of effects of this intentional housing policy can be seen everywhere today. Not least of which is, if you've heard of the term heat islands in cities, these are areas of cities where the residents suffer from more extreme levels of heat and the ecological consequences that that has. And it's because there's less permeable land, there is less green canopy. And so those red-lined areas don't just suffer from economic and financial deprivation, they suffer from environmental injustice. Okay, other public programs. The Social Security Act of 1935, Title II provides old age survivors and disability insurance. But when it was enacted, it excluded domestic workers and farm workers. And 65% of the people employed in those occupations were indeed African Americans. And so they were excluded from the Social Security program. Now in 1950 and in 1954, some adjustments were made to the Social Security program so that those workers had a greater opportunity to participate. But because of the history and the years or decades of lack of participation, many still do not. Further, within the Social Security Act of 1935, there were other programs that provided benefits to Americans, but these were funded by block grants to states for local administration. And in area after area, particularly in the South, but not exclusively there, the implementation and the distribution of these funds heavily favored white Americans over African Americans. And we look at the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, which was touted as one of the most race-neutral benefits acts ever passed by Congress. And that was true in theory. The GI Bill provided for mortgage and other loans, home improvement loans and others, and also education benefits. But a senator from Mississippi, in order to reach a compromise that would ensure Southern states' support for passage, was able to add to the GI Bill the provision that its benefits would all be implemented and distributed locally. So once again, the national program was very egalitarian, but the ability of states to implement the GI Bill had a very, very different effect. And so there was discrimination in housing. By using the same characteristics and approaches that the FHA had applied, GIs seeking to purchase housing using this bill faced the same discrimination. Levittown, I believe, was a huge community built after World War II. And African-American veteran after veteran attempted to purchase a home there and was told that they didn't qualify. There was discrimination in education. One of the things the GI Bill did was to help returning veterans get, particularly a college education, more education. So the two options basically were college education and vocational. In the case of African-American veterans, they were typically steered by local administration to vo-tech schools. If they wanted to go to college, attempted to go to college, there was a limited number of places available in the historically Black colleges and universities that were overwhelmed with applications of returning Black GIs. And there were quotas on the number of African-American students that would be admitted in other Southern schools. And then there were colleges that wouldn't admit Black students at all. And even when directed to vo-tech programs, there were numerous instances when the Black GIs showed up for classes only to discover that the equipment available for training in the vo-tech area was restricted for use to white students. So the GI Bill, rather than being the hoped for window of opportunity for equity, intensified segregation, and it had increased economic consequences. And just like we discussed in the last class about lynchings following World War I, there was significant violence against Black veterans after World War II. And so there were veterans, African-American veterans, lynched in their uniforms. And there's a story of a returning GI named Isaac Woodard. On the evening of February 12th, 1946, Isaac Woodard, who was a 26-year-old Black Army veteran, he boarded a bus in Augusta, Georgia. Earlier that day, he'd been honorably discharged and he was heading to Winsboro, South Carolina to reunite with his wife. The bus driver made a stop en route and Woodard asked if he had time to use the bathroom. The driver cursed at him and they got back on the bus and nothing was said until the bus made another stop in Batesburg, South Carolina. And there, the driver contacted the local police and told them about Isaac's impudence. And Woodard was ordered off the bus. When he tried to give his version of the events, a police officer struck him with a nightstick. He was escorted to jail, where he was repeatedly beaten by the police chief, and said that Scholl pounded him in his eyes with the end of the nightstick until he blacked out. Once Woodard regained consciousness, he couldn't see. And this is a little known story of the violence perpetrated against African Americans, and especially impactful because here was a man who had fought for his country, and this is the way his country treated him. Now we're going to look at school desegregation, and the 1896 decision of Plessy v. Ferguson of separate but equal had profound impact on the education system in the United States. And so across the country, with very few exceptions, Blacks and white students did not go to school together. And in these cases, the equal part of separate but equal, the violation of that was especially egregious. Until 1954, when the Brown v. Board of Education decision was issued by the Supreme Court. Actually, Delaware was one of the 5 parties plaintiff to that suit. The decision was issued when the court was being led by Earl Warren. When the suit was filed, Fred Vinson was the Chief Justice, but he died, and Eisenhower named the former California Governor Earl Warren as Chief Justice. Then Eisenhower hosted a dinner party to explain to Chief Justice Warren that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes. And Eisenhower was later said to have said that appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court was the worst decision that he ever made. In any case, the court issued the decision that school segregation was unconstitutional. Well, the resistance was massive. In Delaware, the state issued a 12-year delay in implementation, the district court. In Prince Edward County in Virginia, they closed all the public schools. From 1959 to 1964, no one could go to public school. So that affected Black and white students equally, except that segregationists in the South sent funds to Virginia to create schools that white students could attend, but not all white students. And so the impact on the educational attainment of the society at large was negatively impacted, regardless of your race. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina declared that the federal courts had no jurisdiction over them, and they were going to pay no attention to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Georgia repealed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, their ratification, and voted to impeach the Supreme Court. And something called the Southern Manifesto was created, and its tactics were to stall and delay, stall and defy. And so you may have seen the pictures of the Little Rock Nine, 9 Black high school students brave enough to try to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then little 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, you may have seen this picture of her being accompanied by federal marshals so that she could go to 1st grade. Excuse me. You may also have seen the Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby and the marshals with graffiti painted on a wall behind her. These are powerful images. Ruby was one of 6 students identified by the NAACP in New Orleans. where the parents said that they would allow their little 6-year-olds to desegregate the elementary school. But the night before school started, Ruby's parents got a phone call from the NAACP saying that the other parents had backed out. They were terrified about the danger to their little children. And so Ruby desegregated the elementary school all by herself. Every teacher but one in the school refused to have Ruby in their class. The parents said they would not allow their students, their children, to attend school if Ruby was allowed to attend. But she did. And she and her teacher met alone in a classroom for the whole year. And it was only later in the spring that, in the midst of a lesson, Ruby heard noise outside and looked and saw that there was a large group of white children playing on the playground. They were going to school. They were going to class in the elementary school, but they were in a part of the building that Ruby didn't see and didn't realize that she and her teacher were all alone in one section of the building. She has become a powerful advocate for civil rights. I heard her speak at Smith College a number of years ago. She has a compelling story and she's written a powerful book about it. I commend it to you. But images like this began appearing on TV screens across the country. And there were people, largely in the North and West, who said, this isn't right. Well, probably the pivotal triggering event came about as a result of people being able to see what was happening. And the pivotal event was the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett was a 14-year-old boy from Detroit who went south to visit his uncle. And he was there during the summer. And he and his cousins went to the Bryant's General Store. And when Emmett went in, something happened. But the wife of the proprietor claimed that Emmett had assaulted her. So Emmett and his cousins left and went home. And 2 nights later, Roy Bryant, the woman's husband, and her brother-in-law, J.W. Milan, arrived at Emmett's uncle's house and took Emmett, who disappeared. And no one knew for sure what had happened to him, though they assumed it had something to do with the event at the general store, until his body turned up in the Tallahatchie River. An industrial weight had been tied around his neck with barbed wire. His eye had been gouged out, and he had been underwater for several days. His mother, Mamie Till, in Detroit, made the decision that Emmett's funeral would include an open casket so that people could see what racial terror had done to her son. And Jet magazine managed to obtain a photograph of Emmett that was published across the country. And the impact was profound. That was 1955. In 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott took place. For 1 year, Black residents of Montgomery refused to take the bus. And of course, they were the predominant riders of the bus system. And people banded together to offer rides, to pay for taxis so that people could get to work but not take the bus. And after a year, the bus company folded in its statement that the black and white segregation on buses pointed out by the famous Rosa Parks would no longer take place. And in 1957, segregation in interstate transportation was declared unconstitutional. In 1960, sit-ins at the Greensboro lunch counter, the Woolworths, took place. And again, videos and images of well-dressed, polite, quiet Black people seeking to be served at a lunch counter and being turned away and refused, ketchup poured on their heads, pulled off the stools, thrown to the floor and beaten. These images began appearing on the news. And so this incredible discrimination and violence that had been existing for decades, if not centuries, in the South suddenly became visible across the country. In 1961, the Freedom Rides began. And in 1963, the famous March on Washington took place in Washington, D.C., the site of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. 1963 was also the occasion of a significant event at the 16th Street Baptist Church. At 10:22 on that Sunday morning, as the church was preparing for Youth Day, 4 Ku Klux Klan members had planted 19 sticks of dynamite underneath a stairwell. Excuse me. And at 10:22, the bomb exploded. 4 little girls were killed: Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. And Addie Mae's sister, Sarah, survived, but was blinded by the blast. Everyone knew who had done this. Everyone knew. In fact, they spoke openly about having planted the bomb. This was 1963. No action was taken until 1977, 2001, and 2002. 3 of the perpetrators were tried and found guilty. Of course, there's probably some poetic justice in that, because had they been tried in 1963, they would almost certainly have been found not guilty by a white jury. So in 1964, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, there was the murder of 3 civil rights activists whose their car was stopped. It was 2 white men and a Black man. Their car was stopped for a traffic violation, and they were murdered by the police. Their bodies buried in a shallow grave and subsequently disinterred. In 1964, as a consequence of all of this becoming visible in the country, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. They also ratified the 24th Amendment that eliminated a federal poll tax. In 1965, the famous Selma to Montgomery voting rights march occurred. I suspect many of you have seen the video Good Trouble, or have seen other reporting that took place around the time of Representative John Lewis's death, have seen the pictures of the well-dressed, respectful African-American citizens seeking to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and being met by police with nightsticks and horses and dogs. And this violence and the awareness of it led in 1965 to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which was considered one of the most profound pieces of legislation, civil rights legislation, ever passed by Congress. But it has a sad coda that we will get to in video number 5 in our series. In 1968, marked the assassinations of civil rights activists Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. A tumultuous time, for sure, but a time when action toward equity in law began to appear. So, if you're watching this with a group, here are some questions you might want to discuss, or you may have other topics that come to mind for your conversation. Or if you are watching this alone, some things for you to reflect upon and perhaps discuss with others at a subsequent point in time. What did you learn that you didn't know? What did you learn that surprises you? In what ways do the discriminatory housing policies of Jim Crow laws and the FHA and the GI Bill affect the lives of Black people even today? What is your thoughts about the ways that implementation of the GI Bill intentionally disadvantaged Black veterans, and indeed about the treatment in general of Black veterans following World War II? And finally, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s affected significant change in our country, but we are not where we need to be. So, what's missing? Thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you for part 4 of our series.